Welcome to the Unseen Shelf. Today we will explore part 2 of Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins. 1975 to 1981, which is the first chapter in part 2, explores how John Perkins witnessed the escalating dangers of economic manipulation, from Panama's fight for the canal to the fall of the Shah of Iran, revealing how leaders who resisted U.S. financial control often met tragic ends, whether through political coups, assassinations, or military intervention. Continuously from 1981 to 2016, John Perkins saw the economic hitman model expand beyond Latin America and the Middle East. As the U.S. increasingly used debt, privatization, and financial coercion to control global markets, while China adopted similar tactics, creating a new era of economic warfare between superpowers. Lastly, John Perkins describes China's economic hitman EHM strategy, which mirrors the U.S. playbook, using massive infrastructure loans, debt dependency, and strategic investments through initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, to expand its influence, secure resources, and bind nations to its economic and political orbit, just as the U.S. did through the IMF and World Bank. Let's begin. John Perkins had seen how economic hitmen used debt to control nations, but in Panama, the stakes were even higher. The Panama Canal wasn't just infrastructure, it was power, a lifeline for global trade, and a symbol of U.S. dominance in Latin America. And Omar Torrijos wanted it back. As the Panamanian leader fought for sovereignty over the canal, Washington pushed back with economic pressure, diplomatic manipulation, and covert threats. Perkins was sent to convince Panama's officials that U.S. control was in their best interest, using the usual tactics: promises of development loans, economic forecasts that justified American oversight, and the subtle warning that opposing Washington came with consequences. But Torrijos wouldn't be swayed. He openly denounced the U.S. for treating Panama like a colony and vowed to negotiate the return of the canal, no matter the cost. This defiance made him a target, the kind of leader the empire couldn't afford to let succeed. It was during this time that Perkins crossed paths with Graham Greene, the famous British writer known for his novels on political corruption and imperialism. Greene had come to support Torrijos, recognizing him as one of the few leaders who genuinely fought for his country's independence. Through their conversations, Perkins saw his own work in a new light, not as economic development, but as modern-day colonization. Torrijos eventually secured the Panama Canal treaties, a rare victory against U.S. influence. But Perkins knew it wouldn't end there. Washington didn't take humiliation lightly, and history had shown that leaders who defied the empire often paid the ultimate price. Torrijos had won for now, but the jackals were waiting. John Perkins had seen how the U.S. controlled nations through debt, but in Iran, he witnessed a different kind of manipulation, one built on political alliances, oil, and military power. At the center of it all was Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, known as the King of Kings, a ruler installed and backed by Washington to protect Western economic interests. For decades, the Shah had been a loyal U.S. ally, ensuring that Iran's vast oil reserves remained under Western control. In exchange, America provided him with weapons, military training, and economic aid. Iran was promoted as a model of modernization, but beneath the surface, the country was boiling with unrest. The Shah's regime was brutal, silencing opposition through torture, secret police, and political repression. Perkins' job was to help justify continued U.S. financial support for Iran. His reports, like those he had written for other nations, painted an illusion of prosperity, ensuring that billions in loans continued to flow into the country. But these funds didn't reach the Iranian people. Instead, they enriched the Shah, his inner circle, and the American corporations that controlled Iran's oil and infrastructure projects. However, resistance was growing. Iranian nationalists, students, and religious leaders were calling for an end to foreign influence, demanding that Iran's resources benefit its own people, not the West. The most vocal opponent was Ayatollah Khomeini, who had been exiled but was gaining a powerful following. Perkins sensed something was about to break. The same strategy that had worked in other countries was failing in Iran. The people weren't buying into the economic deception, and resentment toward the Shah and his American backers was reaching a breaking point. For the first time, Perkins wondered, what happens when an empire backs the wrong man for too long? The answer was coming soon, and it wouldn't be pretty. John Perkins had spent years rationalizing his role as an economic hitman, convincing himself that his work helped nations develop, modernize, and integrate into the global economy. But Iran was proving to be a lesson in what happens when those illusions collapse. During his time in Iran, Perkins met a former Iranian official who had once supported the Shah's pro-Western policies but had since fallen out of favor. This man had once believed in the American dream of economic progress, trusting that foreign investment would bring prosperity. Instead, he had seen his country's wealth siphon off, its people growing angrier, and its government becoming more brutal in its attempts to suppress dissent. Now he was a broken man, tortured, discarded, and hunted by the very system he had once served. His confession shook Perkins to his core. He spoke of secret deals, corporate greed, and how the Shah's regime had been built on a lie financed by U.S. banks, justified by economic forecasts, and enforced by violence. Perkins listened, realizing that this man's fate was a warning. He had seen firsthand what happened when leaders trusted the promises of economic hitmen. They either became puppets of the empire or were crushed by it. Iran was on the brink of revolution, and the Shah's days were numbered. Yet Washington refused to see the signs, continuing to pour money into a regime that had already lost the support of its own people. For the first time, Perkins began to ask himself, what happens when an entire empire is built on deception? And what happens when the people wake up? He could feel the world shifting beneath him, and he was no longer sure which side he was on. John Perkins had seen many leaders manipulated by debt, but in Iran, the game was collapsing. The Shah, once the U.S.'s most prized ally in the Middle East, was losing control. The streets were filled with protesters, strikes, and an uprising that no amount of military aid or economic deals could suppress. For decades, the Shah had been propped up by U.S. money, weapons, and corporate investments, ensuring that Iran's oil remained in Western hands. But his reign was built on fear, repression, and growing inequality, and now the people were fighting back. Perkins saw the empire's classic response to a failing puppet regime: more loans, more weapons, more desperate attempts to prop up a government that had already lost legitimacy. But this time, the strategy wasn't working. The Iranian people weren't just rejecting the Shah. They were rejecting the entire U.S.-backed system that had controlled their economy and politics for decades. In 1979, the inevitable happened. The Shah was overthrown in the Iranian Revolution. He fled, abandoned by his own people, and Washington scrambled to find a way to maintain control over Iran's oil. But the new leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, made it clear there would be no deals, no U.S. control, no Western corporations profiting off Iran anymore. For Perkins, this was a warning sign. The same system he had helped build, the one that trapped countries in debt and forced them into economic submission, had limits. When people had nothing left to lose, they resisted. The fall of the Shah wasn't just the collapse of a king. It was a crack in the empire's strategy. And that crack was only getting bigger. Colombia was not just another country in Latin America. It was a strategic stronghold for U.S. influence in the region. Its location, resources, and political instability made it the perfect place for economic hitmen and U.S. corporate interests to operate. John Perkins saw firsthand how the same playbook used in Panama, Ecuador, and Iran was now being applied to Colombia, but with even deadlier consequences. Colombia's wealth wasn't just in oil, coffee, and minerals. It was in its geopolitical position. As a gateway between Central and South America, it was crucial for U.S. military and economic interests. Perkins' job was to convince Colombian leaders to accept massive loans for infrastructure projects, just as he had done in other nations. The promise was always the same: development, modernization, and foreign investment. But the reality was different. The loans were a trap, ensuring that Colombia remained financially dependent on U.S. institutions. The money went to American corporations, while Colombia was left with crippling debt and political instability. Those who resisted, whether politicians, activists, or community leaders, were met with violence. Unlike other countries, Colombia had deep ties to drug cartels and paramilitary groups, making resistance even more dangerous. The U.S. justified its increasing presence in Colombia by framing it as part of the war on drugs. But Perkins knew better. It wasn't about drugs, it was about control. The same highways and ports built with U.S. loans were used not just for trade, but for military operations and resource extraction. Colombia was becoming a battlefield for economic warfare, with the U.S. ensuring that its government remained aligned with American corporate and political interests. Perkins saw how Colombia's fate was sealed. It would never be truly independent, not as long as its economy, infrastructure, and political system were tied to Washington's financial grip. And in Latin America, those who tried to break free didn't last long. John Perkins had once believed in the ideals of the American Republic, a nation built on democracy, freedom, and opportunity. But after years of working as an economic hitman, he saw the truth. The United States had transformed into something very different, a global empire driven by corporate greed, economic coercion, and military force. The founding principles of America had been about self-governance and independence, but now the U.S. was forcing other nations into dependency. Through institutions like the World Bank and IMF, it dictated economic policies to developing countries, trapping them in cycles of debt that stripped them of their sovereignty. Leaders who cooperated were rewarded. Those who resisted were overthrown or assassinated. But the transformation wasn't just happening abroad. Perkins realized that the empire wasn't just controlling foreign nations, it was consuming America itself. The same corporations that exploited Latin America, Africa, and Asia were gaining control over the U.S. government, shaping policies to benefit the ultra-wealthy while leaving ordinary Americans behind. The divide between corporate power and democratic ideals was growing wider, and the lines between business and government had all but disappeared. This was no longer the country Perkins had been taught to believe in. The American Republic was fading, replaced by an empire that ruled not through direct conquest, but through economics, debt, and corporate dominance. The wars weren't just fought with soldiers, they were fought with bank loans, trade deals, and financial dependency. And the question remained, could the Republic still be saved, or had the empire already won? John Perkins had built a career that looked impressive on paper, a top economist working with governments, international financial institutions, and major corporations. His resume was filled with prestigious titles and projects that promised economic growth and modernization. But as he looked closer, he realized it was all a lie. The reports he had written, the forecasts he had created, the deals he had helped negotiate, they weren't about helping countries develop. They were about trapping them in debt, making them dependent on U.S. corporations, and ensuring that American interests always came first. His work had helped secure billion-dollar loans that benefited only a handful of elites, while ordinary citizens in these countries sank deeper into poverty. At conferences and high-level meetings, he was treated as a respected expert, praised for his role in advancing global development. But behind the polished image was the truth. He had been a tool of economic imperialism, ensuring that the global financial system served a small, powerful elite at the expense of the majority. Even worse, he saw how this deception wasn't unique to him. The entire economic and political system was built on false promises, exaggerated projections, and manipulated data. Governments, financial institutions, and multinational corporations operated under the illusion of progress, while the real goal was control and profit. Perkins had spent years convincing himself that his work was necessary, even noble. But now the facade was cracking. He wasn't just questioning the system, he was questioning himself. And he knew that if he wanted to break free from this deception, he would have to make a choice: continue the lie or expose the truth. John Perkins had spent years justifying his role as an economic hitman. He had told himself that he was helping developing nations modernize, that the loans and projects he facilitated would lead to progress. But after witnessing Jaime Roldós' death in Ecuador, he could no longer ignore the truth. The system didn't serve the people. It served an empire built on deception, greed, and control. Roldós had been a leader who refused to bow to corporate power, and now he was dead, just like Omar Torrijos of Panama, who had also defied U.S. interests. Two leaders in the same year, both dying in plane crashes under suspicious circumstances. Perkins knew what this meant. Refusing to cooperate with the empire was a death sentence. His guilt became unbearable. Every deal he had negotiated, every financial projection he had manipulated, every government he had pressured, it was all part of a machine that crushed nations, toppled leaders, and left ordinary people in poverty. He could no longer lie to himself. So he made a decision. He had to leave. But quitting wasn't simple. He knew too much. His colleagues warned him that no one just walks away from this kind of work. There were unspoken threats, pressures, and incentives to stay quiet. If he spoke out, he risked losing everything, or worse. Yet, he couldn't stay in the game any longer. The corruption, the lies, the hidden hands controlling governments, it was too much. He resigned from Chas T. Maine, leaving behind his high-paying career, his influence, and the power that once intoxicated him. But leaving didn't erase the past. He had been part of the system, and he couldn't undo the damage. Now, the only question left was, what would he do with the truth? The story so far is how John Perkins started his career as a hitman until his quit. Even though Perkins quit in 1981, he didn't immediately expose the system. He remained silent for years, trapped between fear and conscience. He saw firsthand how leaders who resisted the empire met violent ends, making him hesitant to reveal what he knew. During this time, he watched as the economic hitman model evolved, no longer just about manipulating economies, but now reinforced by military intervention, intelligence operations, and corporate-driven wars. The invasions of Panama and Iraq, the collapse of economies under IMF control, and the growing corporate dominance over U.S. politics all reinforced the realization that the empire was stronger than ever. Haunted by what he had been a part of, he finally decided to break his silence, publishing Confessions of an Economic Hitman in 2004, not just as a confession, but as a warning about a system that was still expanding. From 1981 to 2004, John Perkins, having left his role as an economic hitman, struggled with guilt, corporate pressures, and the fear of speaking out, while witnessing how the U.S. empire continued to expand its control through debt, regime changes, and military interventions, culminating in wars driven by the same economic forces he once served. John Perkins had left his role as an economic hitman, but he couldn't escape the consequences of the system he had once served. The empire didn't just manipulate economies, it removed anyone who refused to comply. And in Ecuador, history was repeating itself. After the suspicious death of Jaime Roldós in 1981, Ecuador continued to struggle under the weight of foreign debt, corporate exploitation, and U.S. pressure. But in the early 2000s, a new leader emerged, one who, like Roldós, was willing to fight back against economic imperialism. This time, it was President Rafael Correa. He openly challenged the IMF, World Bank, and multinational oil companies, demanding that Ecuador's wealth be used to benefit its people, not foreign investors. He resisted the debt traps and economic policies designed to keep Ecuador dependent on the U.S. Perkins watched as Korea's defiance drew the same reaction as Roldós years before. Washington saw him as a threat. The same tactics were used: media manipulation, economic pressure, and political destabilization. And just like with Roldós, whispers of assassination attempts and covert operations surfaced. Though Korea survived multiple attempts to remove him, Perkins knew that Ecuador's fight against the empire was far from over. He had seen it before: leaders could resist, but the system always found ways to strike back. The question remained: would Ecuador's fight for independence succeed, or would history repeat itself once again? John Perkins had already seen what happened to leaders who resisted U.S. economic control. Jaime Roldós in Ecuador had died in a mysterious plane crash in 1981 after challenging big oil. But Roldós wasn't the only one. That same year, another leader met the same fate: Omar Torrijos, the president of Panama. Torrijos had done what no other Panamanian leader had dared. He negotiated the return of the Panama Canal from U.S. control, securing the 1977 treaties that would transfer the canal back to Panama by the end of the century. He openly rejected bribes, resisted the pressure of economic hitmen, and refused to let Panama become another U.S. puppet state. That made him a major threat to U.S. interests. Washington wasn't willing to lose control of one of the world's most strategic trade routes without a fight. When economic manipulation failed, covert tactics followed. On July 31, 1981, Torrijos' plane crashed into the mountains, killing him and everyone on board. The official story? Pilot error. But for those who understood how the empire worked, the truth was far more sinister. Perkins knew the pattern. When economic hitmen failed to control a leader, the jackals took over. Torrijos had even predicted his own fate, telling his close circle that if anything happened to him, it would be because of the CIA. After his death, U.S. influence in Panama quickly returned. Though the canal transfer proceeded as planned, Panama's leadership fell back under Washington's control. And years later, when another Panamanian leader, Manuel Noriega, refused to cooperate, the U.S. didn't just orchestrate a covert coup. It launched a full-scale invasion. Torrijos had stood up to the empire. And like Roldós, he paid the ultimate price. John Perkins had left his role as an economic hitman, but he couldn't leave behind the system he once served. Even outside of his former work, he saw how the same forces of corporate greed, political influence, and economic deception continued to shape the world, and now they were expanding into the energy sector. In the 1980s, Perkins started his own energy company, believing he could create a business that promoted sustainability rather than exploitation. He envisioned a model that would help communities develop renewable energy solutions rather than falling into the traps of foreign debt and resource extraction. But he quickly learned that the system didn't welcome outsiders, especially those who wanted to change the rules. Powerful oil and energy corporations, many with deep ties to Washington, controlled the industry. Perkins' company became a target of corporate sabotage, political pressure, and economic isolation. He was warned that his vision threatened major interests, particularly those tied to the Bush family and its connections to big oil, Wall Street, and the military-industrial complex. By the time George W. Bush rose to power in the early 2000s, it was clear energy wasn't just about fuel, it was about control. The wars in the Middle East, the growing influence of oil giants, and the push to maintain U.S. dominance over global energy markets were all part of the same game Perkins had seen before. The economic hitmen never disappeared. They had simply evolved, using new corporations, new strategies, and even more powerful political connections. Perkins had tried to build something different, but the empire didn't allow alternatives. His company failed, not because of market forces, but because real change was a threat to those who profited from the status quo. And now, with the Bush administration leading the charge, it was clear the next phase of economic warfare was beginning. John Perkins had spent years justifying his actions as an economic hitman, convincing himself that he was helping developing nations modernize. But after he quit, he faced a different kind of battle, one that tested his own morality, integrity, and fear. After leaving Chas T. Main, he thought he had escaped the empire's grasp. But the system didn't let go so easily. He was approached by former colleagues and corporate executives who offered him lucrative consulting jobs, financial security, and the chance to re-enter the world of high-powered business. The message was clear: stay silent, and you'll be rewarded. Speak out, and you'll face consequences. At first, he refused. But then came an offer that was too tempting, a large sum of money for a job that seemed harmless, consulting for firms connected to the very system he had once been part of. He took the money, and with that, he became complicit once again. The bribe wasn't just about money. It was about keeping him quiet, making sure he didn't expose what he knew. He realized that this was how the empire maintained control, not just over nations, but over individuals who had worked within it. Guilt consumed him. He had walked away from his past, only to let himself be pulled back in. The money came easily, but the cost was his conscience. He had seen what happened to people like Jaime Roldós and Omar Torrijos, leaders who had resisted and paid with their lives. Was this why he had accepted the bribe? To protect himself? It was a moment of reckoning. He could continue to stay silent, take the money, and live comfortably, or he could finally tell the truth, no matter the risks. This was the turning point. He had to make a choice, and for the first time in his life, he chose to fight back. John Perkins had seen economic hitmen fail before, and he knew what came next. When leaders refused to be controlled through debt, bribery, and economic coercion, the U.S. turned to its last resort: military intervention. That's exactly what happened in Panama in 1989. After the suspicious death of Omar Torrijos in 1981, the U.S. needed a new leader in Panama, one who would follow Washington's orders and ensure continued U.S. control over the Panama Canal. At first, that leader was Manuel Noriega, a former CIA asset who had cooperated with U.S. intelligence for years. But when Noriega started acting independently, refusing to bow completely to American interests, the empire turned against him. The media painted Noriega as a drug kingpin, a dictator, and an enemy of democracy. The U.S. used this narrative to justify Operation Just Cause, a full-scale military invasion of Panama in December 1989. Perkins saw it for what it was: a brutal reminder that the empire would use force when economic manipulation failed. The invasion was swift and devastating. Thousands of Panamanians died, entire neighborhoods were destroyed, and Noriega was removed from power. He was arrested, extradited to the U.S., and sentenced to prison. But the real purpose of the invasion wasn't to stop drug trafficking. It was to send a message to the world. No leader could defy the empire and survive. Washington installed a new, compliant government, ensuring that the canal remained under U.S. influence, even after its official transfer to Panama in 1999. Perkins realized that this was the final stage of economic warfare. When persuasion and covert action failed, bombs and bullets took their place. Panama was a warning to the world: resist the empire, and you will be destroyed. John Perkins had watched for decades as economic hitmen, EHMs, used debt, privatization, and financial control to subjugate nations. In most cases, the strategy worked, leaders were coerced, economies were manipulated, and U.S. corporations gained control over resources. But sometimes, the empire's tactics failed. And when that happened, war followed. That's exactly what happened in Iraq. For years, the U.S. had tried to bring Saddam Hussein into its sphere of influence. During the 1980s, Iraq had been a U.S. ally, supported in its war against Iran. But when Saddam refused to play by Washington's rules, choosing independence over submission, the narrative shifted. He was no longer a useful dictator. He was a threat. The economic hitmen had tried their usual tactics. They had offered loans, business deals, and promises of wealth if Saddam would open Iraq's oil fields to Western corporations. But he refused. He nationalized Iraq's oil industry and kept the country free from IMF and World Bank control, something the U.S. couldn't tolerate. When EHMs failed, the jackals moved in covert operations, political destabilization, and intelligence strategies to weaken his regime. But Saddam held on. And so the final stage came war. In 2003, under the pretext of weapons of mass destruction, the U.S. invaded Iraq, toppling Saddam's government in weeks. But unlike in Panama, the war didn't bring stability. It created chaos, insurgency, and long-term occupation. Instead of a quick takeover, Iraq became a quagmire, proving that even military intervention had its limits. For Perkins, Iraq was the ultimate EHM failure, the perfect example of what happened when economic control didn't work. The empire had to resort to brute force, and in doing so, it exposed its own desperation. Iraq was supposed to be another success story. Instead, it became a symbol of the empire's overreach and its slow unraveling. From 2004 to 2016, I witnessed how the economic hitman model evolved. As corporations and financial institutions expanded their reach, new economic hitmen replaced the old, and even the U.S. itself began experiencing the same tactics of debt manipulation and corporate control that had long been used against developing nations. I had spent years exposing the hidden mechanisms of economic imperialism, revealing how corporations, governments, and financial institutions manipulated nations through debt, political pressure, and covert operations. But speaking out against the empire came with risks. And one day, I found myself wondering if those risks had caught up with me. During a trip abroad, I suddenly fell violently ill. My symptoms were severe and unexplainable, intense nausea, extreme weakness, and dizziness that left me bedridden for days. At first, I thought it was food poisoning or a common illness, but as time passed, I began to question whether it was something more sinister. I had seen how the system silenced those who threatened it. Leaders like Jaime Roldós and Omar Torrijos had died in mysterious plane crashes after resisting U.S. influence. Whistleblowers and journalists had been discredited, intimidated, or eliminated. Could it be that I was now a target? There were reasons to be paranoid. Since publishing Confessions of an Economic Hitman in 2004, I had exposed some of the most powerful interests in the world. I had named names, revealed strategies, and shown how the U.S. empire operated without firing a single shot until it needed to. Was this just a coincidence? Or was it a warning to stay silent? I recovered, but the experience left me shaken. Whether or not I had been poisoned, the message was clear. I was playing a dangerous game, and the empire was still watching. John Perkins had spent years exposing the death economy, a system driven by corporate greed, debt manipulation, and environmental destruction. It was an economy that thrived on exploitation, war, and unsustainable growth, benefiting a small elite while leaving nations in poverty and ecosystems in ruin. But during a trip to Istanbul, he found himself confronting a different vision, one of a life economy. In Istanbul, he met with activists, business leaders, and thinkers who were challenging the global economic order. They weren't just resisting corporate control, they were building alternatives, proving that economies didn't have to be based on extraction and exploitation. They spoke of sustainable development, ethical business models, and economies that prioritized people and the planet over short-term profits. Unlike the death economy, which depended on endless consumption and destruction, the life economy was about regeneration, restoring communities, empowering workers, and protecting natural resources. Perkins saw the contrast firsthand: the old empire, driven by war, oil, and financial control, versus a new world that could be built on cooperation, sustainability, and shared prosperity. For years, he believed the system was too powerful to change. But in Istanbul, he realized something crucial. Change was already happening. The question wasn't whether the life economy could replace the death economy. It was whether enough people would recognize the choice before it was too late. The empire was still strong, but its foundations were beginning to crack. And Istanbul had shown him that a different future was still possible. John Perkins had long understood that economic hitmen, EHMs, weren't just individuals. They were an entire system, deeply embedded in global finance. And while he had once operated in developing nations, by the early 2000s, he saw how those same exploitative strategies were now being used against the U.S. itself. The financial world had become a breeding ground for corruption, manipulation, and economic warfare. Banks weren't just facilitating loans, they were orchestrating financial crises, engineering collapses, and profiting from the destruction they caused. Every few years, another major banking scandal would emerge, revealing fraudulent lending practices, insider trading, and government bailouts that protected the elite while leaving ordinary people to suffer. One of the most devastating examples was the 2008 financial crisis, where Wall Street banks, fueled by greed and deregulation, crashed the global economy through reckless lending and mortgage-backed securities fraud. The result? Millions lost their homes, jobs, and savings, while the very institutions responsible were bailed out by taxpayers. For Perkins, this was no different from the tactics he had once used to trap developing countries in debt, except now, the victims weren't just in Latin America, Africa, or Asia. They were in the United States. The same corporations and banks that had once exploited other nations were now turning their tactics inward, using economic manipulation to consolidate power at home. The empire wasn't just controlling the world, it was devouring itself. And unless people woke up to how deeply embedded EHMs had become in global finance, another, even bigger collapse was inevitable. John Perkins had once believed that economic hitmen, EHMs, were a relic of the past, a shadowy force confined to the Cold War era of corporate and government collusion. But by the 21st century, he realized that EHMs hadn't disappeared. They had evolved. The new economic hitmen no longer wore suits and worked through direct government contracts. Instead, they operated through multinational corporations, hedge funds, and global financial institutions, using technology, media influence, and privatization deals to exert control in ways that were even more difficult to detect. Where Perkins once helped manipulate economic projections to justify massive loans, today's EHMs use complex financial instruments, algorithm-driven stock trading, and digital debt structuring to lock nations into economic dependency. They disguise their work under labels like foreign investment, economic reform, and development partnerships, but the game remains the same: control through financial leverage. The Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, by China, for example, mirrored many of the tactics the U.S. had used for decades, trapping countries in debt through large-scale infrastructure projects. Tech giants collected and monetized global data, ensuring that corporations, rather than governments, held real power. The influence of private equity firms and billionaire-backed foundations grew, making it harder than ever to tell where the corporate world ended and government control began. Perkins saw it clearly. The new EHMs weren't just working for Washington anymore. They were global, decentralized, and more sophisticated than ever. And unlike in his time, where governments held the upper hand, now corporations were the empire, and their reach was unlimited. If people didn't wake up soon, they wouldn't just lose their nation's sovereignty. They'd lose their personal freedom, their financial independence, and their ability to resist. The new EHMs were everywhere, and the war for economic control had just begun. John Perkins had seen how the economic hitman EHM's strategy evolved, but what disturbed him even more was the emergence of a new kind of enforcer, the modern jackals. In the past, when economic hitmen failed to manipulate a leader through debt, bribes, or corporate influence, the jackals stepped in: covert operatives, intelligence agencies, and mercenaries who ensured compliance through coups, assassinations, and military interventions. Perkins had seen it happen to Jaime Roldós in Ecuador and Omar Torrijos in Panama, both of whom died under suspicious circumstances after resisting U.S. corporate and financial control. But by the 21st century, jackals no longer needed to operate in secrecy. The new millennium's jackals worked in the open, using economic warfare, digital surveillance, cyber attacks, and information control to destroy governments, economies, and individuals who resisted. Instead of overthrowing leaders with military coups, today's jackals use sanctions, economic blackmail, and media disinformation campaigns to cripple economies and delegitimize governments. Leaders who challenge corporate power face financial isolation, character assassination, and sudden political upheavals engineered by external forces. Nations that try to free themselves from IMF and World Bank control are punished through stock market crashes, currency manipulation, and trade wars. Meanwhile, private intelligence firms, contracted by corporations and governments alike, have replaced traditional covert operatives. These new jackalls don't just destabilize governments, they dismantle entire industries, control media narratives, and use digital surveillance to track political movements before they even become threats. Perkins saw it clearly. The new jackalls were no longer rogue operatives. They were built into the system itself. They didn't need bullets to maintain control. They had algorithms, economic warfare, and the full power of the digital age at their disposal. And the worst part? Most people didn't even realize they were under attack. John Perkins began examining China's EHM strategy because he saw that the same economic manipulation tactics he once used for the US were now being replicated by China, but with a new approach. While the US historically used covert financial coercion and military-backed control, China was leveraging soft power through massive infrastructure investments, offering loans and partnerships that often led to long-term economic dependency. Instead of outright regime change, China used economic entrapment, resource control, and debt diplomacy to achieve its goals, making it the first real challenger to the US's economic empire. Perkins realized that the global economic battlefield was shifting, and the US was no longer the only player using EHMs to control the world. China's economic hitman EHM strategy mirrors the US playbook, using massive infrastructure loans, debt dependency, and strategic investments through the Belt and Road Initiative (BRI) to expand its global influence, securing resources and political leverage much like the US did with the IMF and World Bank. For decades, John Perkins had seen the US dominate the global economy through debt traps, corporate influence, and financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank. But by the 21st century, a new player had emerged, China. And it wasn't just competing with the US, it was rewriting the rules of economic warfare. China wasn't using military invasions or CIA-backed coups to expand its influence. Instead, it leveraged its vast financial resources, infrastructure projects, and long-term economic partnerships to gain control over developing nations. Through the Belt and Road Initiative (BRI), China poured trillions into roads, railways, ports, and energy projects, offering low-interest loans that seemed generous at first, but often led to deep financial dependence. Unlike the US, which had spent decades dictating economic policies through Western financial institutions, China positioned itself as a friend to the developing world, offering funding without political strings, at least on the surface. But the strategy was clear. Nations that couldn't repay their debts found themselves handing over key assets, ports, mines, and land, giving China long-term control. Perkins saw that China had learned from the US's economic hitman model, but had adapted it into something more patient, more strategic, and potentially even more effective. While Washington used debt to maintain influence, China used it to gain ownership. For the first time in history, the balance of global economic power was shifting. The US was no longer the only empire using economic warfare. China was now playing the same game, and in some cases playing it better. The question was no longer whether China was an emerging power, it was how long before it overtook the US as the world's leading economic empire. For years, John Perkins had believed that economic hitmen, EHMs, were a uniquely American creation, a tool used by the US government, multinational corporations, and financial institutions to trap developing nations in debt. But by the 21st century, he saw that China had perfected the model and given it a new face. Unlike the US, which relied on IMF and World Bank loans, China's EHMs worked through state-backed banks, massive infrastructure projects, and long-term trade deals. Instead of forcing countries into debt through financial institutions controlled by Washington, China offered low-interest loans, direct investments, and seemingly unconditional economic partnerships. The most powerful tool in China's arsenal was the Belt and Road Initiative (BRI), an ambitious project that financed roads, railways, power plants, and ports in over 150 countries. At first, these projects appeared to be mutually beneficial, providing much-needed development to struggling economies. But just like US-backed loans of the past, the debts soon became unpayable, giving China the leverage to take control of critical assets. One of the clearest examples was Sri Lanka's Hambantota port. Unable to repay its Chinese loans, Sri Lanka was forced to hand over a 99-year lease on the port to China, giving Beijing a strategic foothold in the Indian Ocean. The same pattern was emerging across Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia, nations accepting Chinese money, only to find themselves economically dependent on Beijing. Perkins realized that China's EHMs didn't need CIA-backed coups or military interventions. They played the long game, ensuring that once a country became financially entangled with China, it had little choice but to align with Beijing's interests. The empire had changed hands. The U.S. had once ruled through debt, and now China was using the same strategy to reshape the world in its image. The new EHMs weren't just American or Chinese anymore. They were global. John Perkins had spent years in Latin America, witnessing firsthand how economic hitmen, EHMs, manipulated governments, forced nations into debt, and ensured U.S. corporate control over resources. But by the 21st century, he saw something new. China was now playing the same game. For decades, the U.S. had used the IMF, World Bank, and multinational corporations to dominate Latin America, ensuring that nations like Ecuador, Panama, and Colombia remained economically dependent. Leaders who resisted, like Jaime Roldós and Omar Torrijos, were removed or killed. But now the power struggle had shifted. China was challenging U.S. dominance in the region, offering Latin American countries an alternative. China's approach was different. Instead of using Washington-controlled financial institutions, it poured billions into direct investments, funding massive infrastructure projects, trade agreements, and resource extraction deals. Countries desperate for development and economic stability welcomed these offers. Many had already suffered under U.S.-imposed austerity measures and debt crises. Brazil, Argentina, Venezuela, and Ecuador became major targets of Chinese investment. China offered low-interest loans with fewer political conditions, unlike the U.S., which often demanded privatization, deregulation, and strict neoliberal policies in exchange for aid. Chinese companies built roads, bridges, and energy plants, but like the U.S. before, China's money came with hidden costs. When nations struggled to repay, China gained control over key industries, ports, and natural resources. Perkins realized that Latin America was no longer just under U.S. economic control. It was now caught between two competing economic empires. The region had spent decades fighting off U.S. corporate dominance, and now it faced a new challenge: how to deal with China's growing influence without falling into another cycle of dependency. For Latin America, the question wasn't just about choosing between the U.S. or China. It was about whether it could finally break free from the grip of foreign economic control altogether. John Perkins had seen how economic hitmen, EHMs, reshaped Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East. But in the 21st century, Asia became the ultimate battleground for economic control. For decades, the U.S. had maintained influence in the region through military alliances, trade agreements, and financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank. But now China was emerging as the dominant force, using a strategy more effective and long-term than anything the U.S. had done before. China's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, became Asia's new economic master plan. Countries across the region, Pakistan, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines, signed multi-billion-dollar deals with Beijing, allowing China to build highways, railroads, power plants, and ports. These projects promised economic growth and modernization, but they also left nations with massive debts, often payable only through long-term economic concessions to China. One of the most striking examples was Sri Lanka, where Chinese investments helped fund Hambantota Port. When the country couldn't repay its debt, China took control of the port under a 99-year lease, giving Beijing a strategic foothold in the Indian Ocean. Similar projects in Pakistan's Gwadar Port and Myanmar's Kayakpia Port showed a clear pattern. China wasn't just financing infrastructure, it was positioning itself for long-term dominance. While the U.S. still held economic and military influence in countries like Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, its presence was being challenged in Southeast Asia. Nations that had once relied on Washington were now turning to China for economic opportunities, creating a new power shift that threatened U.S. control over the region. Perkins saw that the battle for Asia was no longer about military force. It was about economic leverage. The question wasn't just who could offer the biggest loans or build the most infrastructure. It was about which superpower could trap more nations in its economic web. And for the first time in history, the U.S. was no longer winning. For decades, Africa had been exploited by Western powers, subjected to colonial rule, resource extraction, and economic manipulation through the IMF and World Bank. John Perkins had seen how the U.S. used debt, privatization, and financial coercion to maintain control over African nations, ensuring that their rich natural resources, Oil, minerals, and agriculture benefited Western corporations more than the people. But by the 21st century, a new player had entered the game, China. China saw what the U.S. had done and took it further. Instead of forcing African nations into deals through the IMF structural adjustment programs, China offered direct investments, infrastructure projects, and low-interest loans. Countries desperate for roads, railways, airports, and energy grids saw China as a more attractive partner than the West. No demands for austerity, no lectures on democracy, just money and development. Through the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, China poured hundreds of billions into Africa, financing projects in Kenya, Ethiopia, Nigeria, Angola, and many others. But these investments came with a hidden price. When nations couldn't repay their debts, China gained control over key assets, such as ports, mines, and energy plants. Just as the U.S. had used economic hitmen to trap nations in debt cycles, China was now using debt diplomacy to expand its influence. In places like Zambia, where Chinese firms took over key industries, and Djibouti, where China built its first overseas military base, it became clear Africa was becoming a battleground for economic control. The US and Europe had spent decades extracting Africa's wealth, but now China was securing its place as the dominant force on the continent. Perkins saw a familiar cycle: new superpowers, same tactics. The question was no longer whether Africa could escape US economic control, it was whether it could avoid falling into China's economic grip. And this time, the game was bigger than ever. John Perkins had long understood that the Middle East was never just about religion or democracy. It was about oil, power, and economic control. For decades, the U.S. had dominated the region, using economic hitmen, EHMs, military alliances, and direct interventions to ensure that its corporations and government controlled the world's most valuable resource, oil. But in the 21st century, China entered the game, bringing a new approach to Middle Eastern influence. The U.S. had used covert coups, IMF loans, and military interventions to maintain power over nations like Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Iran, ensuring that oil-rich countries remained dependent on the dollar and American energy companies. Leaders who resisted, like Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi, were removed through war, reinforcing the petrodollar system that kept the U.S. economy stable. But China took a different path. Instead of using military force, it leveraged trade, investment, and long-term economic deals to gain a foothold in the region. Through its Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, China signed massive infrastructure agreements with Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the UAE, financing everything from ports and railways to energy projects. Unlike the US, which demanded political loyalty and regime changes, China offered business partnerships with fewer political conditions. One of the biggest shifts came when China brokered a peace deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran, something the US had failed to do for decades. This signaled that Beijing was not just an economic power in the region, it was becoming a diplomatic force as well. For Perkins, this was a warning sign the U.S. was losing its grip on the Middle East. The very same tactics the U.S. had once used to dominate the region, debt, investment, and strategic alliances, were now being used by China. And while Washington was still engaged in military conflicts, Beijing was quietly securing control over trade routes, resources, and economic influence. The Middle East was no longer just America's playground. China was rewriting the rules. For decades, Europe had been seen as a pillar of Western economic power, closely aligned with the United States through NATO, the European Union, and financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank. John Perkins had watched as the U.S. used economic hitmen, EHMs, to control developing nations, but by the 21st century, even Europe was feeling the grip of economic manipulation, and China was emerging as a serious competitor for influence. At first, the U.S. used economic policies, trade agreements, and financial bailouts to ensure Europe remained within its orbit. The 2008 financial crisis exposed just how vulnerable European nations were to economic coercion. Countries like Greece, Spain, and Italy were forced into IMF-backed austerity measures, cutting public spending, privatizing industries, and handing over control of their economies to global financial institutions. The same debt traps that had crippled Latin America and Africa were now being used on Western nations. But as the U.S. tightened its grip, China stepped in with an alternative. Through the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, Beijing began buying European ports, investing in railways, and financing key infrastructure projects. Countries like Greece, Hungary, and Italy saw China as an economic partner, not a colonial force, offering funding without the harsh conditions imposed by U.S.-backed financial institutions. One of the biggest signs of China's influence was its purchase of the port of Piraeus in Greece, turning it into one of Europe's busiest trade hubs. Similarly, Chinese companies invested in high-speed rail systems and energy projects across Central and Eastern Europe, creating new economic dependencies outside of U.S. control. Perkins realized that Europe was no longer just a U.S. stronghold. It had become a battleground between two competing economic empires. While Washington pressured Europe to distance itself from China, Beijing continued to expand its presence, offering long-term investments, trade partnerships, and an economic future not tied to Wall Street or Washington. For the first time in history, Europe faced a choice: remain under U.S. influence or embrace a new economic order shaped by China. The balance of power was shifting, and the empire was no longer just American. For decades, John Perkins had watched as economic hitmen, EHMs, manipulated foreign nations, using debt, financial coercion, and privatization to control economies across Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. But by the 21st century, he saw something he never expected. The same tactics that had once been used abroad were now being used against the United States itself. The very corporations, banks, and financial institutions that had trapped developing nations in cycles of debt were now dismantling the American middle class. Wealth was being concentrated at the top, while ordinary Americans faced stagnant wages, rising debt, and a privatization wave that stripped away public services. The U.S. government, once the master of economic warfare, was now falling victim to the very system it had created. Instead of using the IMF and World Bank to control foreign economies, Wall Street and the Federal Reserve were using credit bubbles, financial deregulation, and corporate bailouts to consolidate power at home. The 2008 financial crisis exposed how deeply embedded EHMs had become within America's own economy. Banks that caused the collapse were bailed out, while millions of ordinary citizens lost their homes, jobs, and financial security. At the same time, China was rising as a direct competitor, using its own EHM strategies to challenge U.S. dominance. While the U.S. had once dictated terms to the rest of the world, it now found itself economically entangled with Beijing, reliant on Chinese manufacturing, trade, and debt purchases to sustain its economy. The empire was no longer untouchable. For Perkins, this was the final warning: no empire lasts forever. The same economic warfare that had controlled and destroyed other nations was now being turned inward, hollowing out the U.S. economy and leaving its people in a system designed to serve only the elite. The question was no longer whether America would remain the dominant superpower. It was whether Americans would wake up before their own country became just another victim of the system it had created. The empire wasn't just expanding, it was collapsing from within. John Perkins had spent his career building an empire through economic manipulation, convincing nations to take on crushing debt, handing control of their resources to multinational corporations, and ensuring that a small elite profited while the majority suffered. He had watched as leaders who resisted were removed, assassinated, or overthrown, and how the system evolved from military-backed interventions to economic warfare and corporate control. But the greatest realization came when he saw that this same system was now turning against the United States itself. The economic hitman EHM model was no longer just being used to control developing nations, it was being used against ordinary Americans, keeping them in cycles of debt, stripping away public services, and ensuring that wealth was concentrated at the top. Yet, the system isn't unstoppable. Perkins argues that every individual has the power to challenge the economic hitman strategy, not just by resisting corporate control, but by supporting a new, sustainable economy, one that prioritizes people over profits. The shift away from a debt-driven, war-fueled economy to one based on sustainability, ethical business, and economic justice is possible, but only if enough people recognize what's happening. It starts with awareness, understanding how the system works, recognizing its patterns, and exposing the truth. It continues with action, demanding policies that break corporate control, supporting ethical businesses, and holding financial institutions accountable. The power isn't just in the hands of governments and corporations, it's in the choices individuals make every day. Perkins leaves readers with a final challenge. Will we continue to allow the economic hitman strategy to dictate the world's future, or will we take action to dismantle it? Because the fate of nations, economies, and future generations depends on the answer. As we close this journey through Confessions of an Economic Hitman, we invite you to reflect on how economic power shapes the world, and to consider what role each of us can play in building a future that prioritizes justice, sustainability, and true global equity. Thank you for your time and thoughtful engagement. If you have any reflections, insights, or topics you'd like to explore further, we'd love to hear from you. We look forward to seeing you again for our next book discussion. If you enjoyed this content, your support through a subscription and a like is truly appreciated. We will see you soon with the next book.